It's another extraordinary development in this incredibly bizarre and unsettling for President Putin's story. The fact that you now have Yevgeny Prigozhin announcing that he is about turning and heading away from Moscow after a whole day of expectation of this convoy moving on the capital is, again, another extraordinary twist. This man has defied his president, effectively, who has been his kind of key mentor, key backer, and also defying the Russian military leaders, accusing them of killing his men, really interrupting the Russian war effort in Ukraine, and instead turning his attention to Russian forces. You had these Wagner troops moving into a city on the border with Ukraine, taking control of that, according to the Wagner chief. There were then explosions in another city on the way towards Moscow, an oil depot set ablaze, and then these images of this convoy heading towards the capital, and President Putin being forced to come out and issue that extraordinary statement earlier today where he accused Prigozhin of armed mutiny. There is criminal charges against this man, a man who has been very close to the president and was a key player in Russia's war effort. His troops, his mercenary fighters, many of them convicts released from prison, key cannon fodder effectively on the ground, but in terms of enabling the Russian forces to push and try to gain ground from the Ukrainians. All of that then upended in this extraordinary row where you had Prigozhin accusing the Russian military of trying to kill his forces, accusing them of corruption, accusing them of hiding thousands of Russian dead, and saying that he wouldn't stop until he'd spoken to them and until he'd got justice. He called this a march for justice. He says it wasn't a military coup. But at the same time, we saw heightened security in Moscow. Russian state television showed images of checkpoints around the capital, and this convoy that Wagner said was of its forces moving towards the capital could only lead to one thing, which would have been potentially a direct engagement. The Wagner chief has already accused Russian forces of firing against his men inside Russia. This whole situation has been extraordinary. You've had the Western countries, including the UK, all watching closely, talking together today, trying to understand what is going on. Everybody says that they believe this to have been the biggest, the gravest threat to Vladimir Putin's rule. And yet, now at this moment of confrontation, it seems that for whatever reason, Prigozhin has been convinced to turn back. But while we're not having a crescendo moment right now, this is not the end of the crisis. Clearly, what has just happened is extraordinary and will need to be dealt with. His complaints that he has made vociferously for a long time over the last few weeks and months, but most spectacularly yesterday, when he was accusing the Russian military leaders, the defense minister, the head of the Russian armed forces, of killing his troops. That has not been settled. And so what happens next clearly is going to be vital as to whether or not this crisis can be contained and President Putin be able to then return to focusing on the war in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And Deborah, looking at what happens next, a lot of people will be looking at the relationship then between the Wagner Group and Russia's military and seeing what kind of role moving forward the Wagner Group will play in the war against Ukraine.
Well, it's hard to imagine that they can continue to play a role unless there is some kind of resolution. I mean, clearly there's now criminal charges against the head of Wagner, and this is a man who used to be dubbed Putin's chef because of his other catering companies that provided food to the Kremlin. He's someone who has been able to adopt a pretty unusual position given the crackdown by the Kremlin about anyone speaking out against Russia's war in Ukraine and Russia's war effort. Prigozhin has alone been able to be highly critical of the defense minister, like I said, of the head of the armed forces. Analysts believe that it's part of this tactic by President Putin in order to keep overall control, almost encourage this infighting between those beneath him so that a single other rival can't become so powerful that they might try to challenge the president. But in this case, if everything that we've seen is what it is what it looks like, as opposed to some other sort of more murky bluff or something, then it would seem that this clear feud between Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense spiraled out of control over the last day or so, resulting in these extraordinary scenes where you have Russian Wagner mercenaries going into a Russian city, which is a backbone of the logistics hub for the Russian war effort in Ukraine, and seizing control of that and then moving towards Moscow and triggering these security alerts in the capital and that extraordinary statement from the president. How you can go from that back to the Wagner mercenaries and the Russian forces fighting alongside each other once again in Ukraine, that's going to be incredibly difficult. So it's really hard to speculate. It's a very confusing situation, and this is just another confusing twist.
And no doubt Prigozhin's move today would have certainly ruffled Putin's feathers, certainly bruising for him, not just his ego, but his position in power and his image as a strongman.
Absolutely, and it's important to note that this comes at a time when the war in Ukraine, remember Vladimir Putin, he staked his entire reputation, his entire presidency on this war, on this invasion, which he hoped to achieve within a few days. It's gone on, and we are now approaching a year and a half of this full-scale war. The Ukrainians are on the offensive themselves. They're fighting, trying to break through Russian lines in the east and the south of the country. So at that moment of real peril for the president, to have suddenly this implosion within his own ranks, it does not speak to a president who has full control of the situation. And there is already this perception of weakness, really, in terms of his relationship with other key allies for Russia, such as the Chinese president. Obviously, you've seen the Russians building this closer military relationship with Iran because it relies so heavily on these countries for support and from Iran for weapons. It all speaks to a leader who has been unable to achieve the goals that he set for himself in Ukraine. And while he still believes that he can achieve success, what's unraveled and unfolded in the last 24 hours must, at a minimum, be hugely unnerving. And more than that, you can only imagine the paranoia that he will be feeling and the need to regain control. And that's why he came out this morning and so strongly tried to reassert his leadership and his command, condemning these actions by his former close ally.